Thank you so much, Ashley. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm really honored that out of all of the sessions that you could have kicked off NSAC with, you started with mine. My name, as I said, is Gabby Boyle. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a prevention specialist at the Sexual Trauma and Abuse Care Center in Lawrence, Kansas. And we're going to be talking about why housing justice is so important to practice as a violence preventionist, and then also kind of looking at my community and the work that we've done there as a case study of sorts. So I'm a big fan of knowing what to expect, and maybe there are some of you that are similar in the room. So I want to give you a rundown of what we're going to cover, just so that you are all prepared. If at any points I use a term that you're not familiar with, or I speak too quickly and you need me to repeat myself, let me know. I certainly get ahead of myself, particularly when I'm talking about housing, which is something I'm really excitable about. So we're going to start by covering some core frameworks and vocabulary that are essential to understanding the work that we've done in our community. Then we're going to move into why is it important for us to be doing this work, as well as why not? What are the barriers to doing this work? I want to spend some time acknowledging and validating those, covering what we've done in Kansas, again in my community, and then zooming back out to that macro lens of lessons that we've learned and what I hope you all take away from this session. But before we dive in, the question of the hour, why are we here, specifically in this room, not just broadly existentially. Everyone, if you want, we can get into it, but everyone here, made an intentional choice, again, to attend this session over the dozens of other offerings that were available at this time. So I'm kind of curious about what context or challenges or experiences in your work brought you to this room. If you're already doing this work, or if you're not already doing this work, or if there's something specific that you hope to learn. So it's a little icebreaker because a part of this conference is also getting to know each other and doing this work together and building relationships. So if you all at your tables or in your rows want to spend 5 minutes introducing yourself and just sort of bouncing a beach ball around, I don't know, weird metaphor, but bouncing back and forth what brought you to this room. And then we can come back to this larger group and see if there are any patterns that emerge. Does that sound cool? All right, go free, be merry. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. The relationships that we started in these very brief introductions, I hope can continue to blossom over the course of this conference, and this conversation can continue outside of this room. But while we're in this room, are there any groups or folks who want to share what they were talking about, or patterns that they noticed, or feelings? We've got Ashley can run a mic. If folks do want to share anything, feel free to shoot up a hand. If not, I'll just grab the reins and keep going.
So we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things that really drew me to this workshop in particular was the focus on housing as prevention and how it's more of an outer layer focus on the SEM. And I feel like in prevention, there's been such a focus on the individual and relationship levels of the social ecological model, and we haven't really moved out into policy and those community level or society level interventions and prevention efforts. And so I'm really happy to see that there's more of a focus, and that's kind of what drew me to this particular workshop.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, the SEM, or the social ecological model, I think I'm relatively new to prevention work. I've been doing this since October 2020. And it was really challenging to move beyond those first couple of layers, the individual and the interpersonal or the relational. So I hope I can speak to some of that in a more practical way. Any other thoughts, feelings, challenges? Yeah.
I don't think I need, but I'll use it anyways. I got a loud voice. So we was talking, well, mainly I was talking, everyone was listening about how the the VOCA money, 1.9 being cut at a time where we definitely need more funding to support our survivors, as well as we talked about, well, talked about the policy level, how our funding stream for our organizations has been monetized because of the language and the policies where it says that if you spend 2 hours with a survivor, then you have to put that into a database because it's directly related to your funding. So trying to get away from the fact that we need more, our survivors' voices need to be at the policy level as opposed to them directing our organizations. And then when we talked about the scarcity model, whereas that we're always running at a deficit, but then at the end of the year, fiscal year, we always have to spend down a whole bunch of money, which means that, services not being fully funded throughout the whole year, but then you have this pot of money and you have to go ahead and buy gift cards. You have to go ahead and buy, this other stuff, right? Which could have actually went to the advocate's salary, opposed to, sitting at the end of the year and get what, $300 bonus, which is still tax deductible. So we talked, that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry, just if you notice anybody around you who needs Spanish interpreting, they need to be tuned to channel 5 because your receivers are picking up neighboring rooms instead of this microphone. And for the benefit of the interpreters, yes, please use the mic.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I love what you said about kind of the relationship between nonprofits, the state, the system, and how that sort of dictates what we can and cannot do, the way that we do those things. And that's a lesson that I certainly learned throughout this process that I'll touch on, hopefully. I'm going to move on just in the interest of time because I have a lot of ground to cover, but I hope that you all feel comfortable, again, continuing these conversations outside of this room, even if that means flagging me down when you see me out and around. As I mentioned, I'm going to cover a couple of core pieces of vocabulary. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly because I imagine these are all familiar to folks in the room, but I don't want to make any assumptions. And also, I want to make sure that any prevention specialists who are new to the fields feel like they can kind of be caught up. So when I am doing work focused on housing, what I'm doing is primary prevention. And so primary prevention is work that is focused on addressing the root causes of violence and addressing violence before it has the opportunity to occur. So it's not an emergency intervention, it's not short-term solutions, it's not victim or survivor advocacy, it's super upstream. When we think about the root causes of violence, really what we're talking about are risk and protective factors, which are exactly what they sound like, right? Conditions that make somebody either more likely to experience violence or less likely to experience violence. And shared risk and protective factors, that is a language or a term that's used to essentially recognize that oftentimes you have a bundle of risk factors that could contribute to multiple negative outcomes. So in addition to being risk and protective factors for something like sexual violence, they may also be risk and protective factors for negative physical health outcomes as well, or other types of violence. And then finally, when we talk about doing systems-based work, which is what I'm going to focus on throughout this session, that comes from the social ecological model, which is adapted from public health, that sort of asserts that there are 4 levels that prevention work can be done on: the individual level, the interpersonal level, the community level, and the systems level. So again, we're really focusing on that systems level, and what that means is that we're thinking about strategies that cast a really wide net that are targeting policies, laws, and widespread social norms. Again, these are upstream and they are typically rooted in anti-oppression. They are not like one-off educational programs or individual skill building or social emotional learning. While those things are really important, that's not what systems-based work is. Additionally, they're not strategies that are focused on a specific enclosed community like an organization or a workplace or a school. Again, we're really trying to affect community in the sense of like a municipality or a territory or state. Does that make sense to anybody? Any questions? Okay, cool. Those are core vocabularies. Now I'm going to transform them into more ideological concepts that are really key to engaging in housing justice. So the first is that all violence is connected by the concept of power, right? Power is something that we talk about a lot, but I think it's helpful to give it a tangible definition. So when I say power, what I'm talking about is the ability of an individual, a group of people, an organization, et cetera, to exert their will, their influence, or their force over another individual, another group of people, another community, et cetera. So when we think about what that means in sexual violence, we're acknowledging that sexual violence is not caused by like an overflow of desire or someone who's unable to control themselves. It's not caused by one type of person inherently being more violent or less violent, right? It's caused by the desire and the ability to make somebody less than, to dehumanize them, to deny them agency, again, ultimately to express one's power. So when we think about power on a systemic level, what we see is that communities, identities, peoples who are systemically disempowered are more likely to experience interpersonal violence, right? That's why we see folks who are gender sexual minorities, who are disabled, Black and Indigenous people of color. That is why populations that are marginalized are more likely to experience interpersonal violence like sexual violence, is because of that systemic disempowerment. Again, when I say systemic disempowerment, really all that means is marginalization and oppression. Acts of systemic violence include racist housing policy like redlining or the intentional neglect or infrastructural devastation of neighborhoods primarily populated by people of color, the theft and the colonization of land, the denial of financial agency or the ability to build wealth. In the United States, this is most noticeable in our credit system, which historically denies financial agency and empowerment, again, primarily to Black folks, but people of color more largely, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all examples of systemic violence. When we think about housing justice, what that means is processes and strategies that are correcting those systemic power imbalances that are either left over or still active from those acts of marginalization and oppression. Does that make sense to everybody? Everybody feeling good? Okay, cool. Like I said, I love to explain things, so let me know if I'm explaining too much also, and I'll just move on. So that was all really ideological. When we think about the direct relationship between doing housing justice-centered work and sexual violence prevention, there are a couple of different angles that we can approach that direct link from. The first is the relationship that we have that's been documented in research. Like a lot of sexual violence research, unfortunately, this data is limited in scope and some of it is quite dated. But what we do see is a pattern of a direct relationship between sexual violence and acute housing crises, specifically homelessness. It's kind of a two-way street where an individual who is unsheltered is more likely to experience sexual violence, but also on the opposite end, what we see is folks who are unsheltered, particularly those who are chronically homeless, typically have long histories of sexual trauma and abuse. And then, of course, there's also instances where sexual violence may cause somebody to be displaced because of that location no longer being safe, right? When we think about the experience of service providers, of folks who are working either with populations experiencing significant housing instability or victim survivors of sexual violence, there is a definite pattern that a lot of survivors are experiencing some form of housing instability, right? Whether that is homelessness, whether that is my current apartment is unaffordable, whether that is, the maintenance person who comes into my apartment makes me feel unsafe and I can't express that to my landlord. As an example of sort of a scenario that could potentially happen and that has happened and that may resonate with you, a survivor who experiences sexual violence may find that the impacts of that trauma make it hard for them to continue to go to work, right? They may have to take time off for medical appointments, whether that's mental or physical health care. If they're pursuing anything in our legal or criminal justice system, they probably have to take time off for court dates, meetings with lawyers. Additionally, just like rest days to recover, right? That may lead, and often does lead, to somebody losing their employment. When you lose your employment, you lose your income. When you cannot pay your rent, what happens is you get evicted, right? So now not only is the survivor dealing with the trauma of sexual violence, that has also become entangled with and bundled with the trauma of displacement and the trauma of eviction and the trauma of having to find a new place to live. When I think this is kind of an interesting angle as well in terms of the relationship between sexual violence and housing. Both fields funnel the majority of their resources and their energy towards temporary emergency solutions. So towards crisis intervention, towards victim advocacy and support, towards emergency shelter or temporary transitional housing, right? But just as is the case in sexual violence, when we think about housing, emergency intervention is really important, but it's not a sustainable solution. And what we see oftentimes is people who are left with little to no support following the exit of a shelter or transitional space. And even if somebody is not experiencing that level of acute crisis, right, where they're unsheltered, where they're having to access emergency intervention, they still may be experiencing some form of housing instability. They can't relocate. They're cramming their family into an apartment that's 600 square feet, right? And they're not able to move. Housing is not accessible to them. So as prevention specialists, as folks who work in prevention, we're often really used to this kind of perspective, right? Of thinking about, okay, like, yes, emergency intervention is important, but what happens afterwards? How do we prevent? And that is not something that a lot of folks working in the housing field have the space, the capacity, the resources, or the skills to do. And so we have to think of ourselves, I loved in the plenary when they mentioned like reciprocity, right? We have to think of ourselves as reciprocal community members, and that when we show up to these spaces, we are not only providing our skills that are really valuable, right? But in turn, we're also working in tandem to address those root causes of all types of violence. So this is all really easy to talk about, right? It's very breezy to read off of a slide, but doing this is not easy. And there are quite many barriers, both very tangible, but also like barriers within ourselves that I think prevent us often from engaging in this work or feeling confident engaging in this work. It's really complicated. Housing is a mess. It's a 1,000-piece puzzle, and the dog has eaten like 40 of those pieces, and the rest are under the kitchen table, right? It's hard to know where to start. Additionally, even if you do know where to start, a lot of us either aren't really used to working with policy, or there is some sort of restriction in terms of funding that dictates what types of political engagement we can and cannot have with our community. I know a lot of folks who are federally funded or state funded, cannot engage in lobbying. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. It's a crowded space. I'm sure we've all been in meetings where there are like 24 people and nothing is getting done and everybody's talking and you're like, why am I even here? Let me tell you, that is tenfold in housing. There are so many people engaging in this work, and it sometimes feels like we're just adding clutter to the conversation. And then finally, one that I think I struggle with, but then the majority of people that I know that work in sexual violence prevention also really feel, is this sense of like imposter syndrome, of no one's gonna take me seriously. Sexual violence prevention is undervalued, it's misunderstood. A lot of people who do this work are also typically, again, undervalued in some sense, whether that be, they're queer, they're people of color, they're women, et cetera. And so that feeling of like, how do I show up to a space where there are decision makers? Like, that's real, right? But if there's one thing I hope you take away from the session, it's if I can do it, you can too. I'm just one weirdo from Kansas, and me and my colleagues, the folks that I worked alongside, were able to create change. So in response to all of these things, right, it's complicated. Yeah, it is. But so is sexual violence prevention. Have you ever tried to explain to your parents what you do for a job? Like, it's horrible, but you're doing it. You can tackle complicated things. I don't know anything about policy, me neither. Before I worked at this job, the only policy that I had ever worked with was a policy about neutering feral cats. I get that, it's really hard, but we learn together, right? We do this work in community with one another. We build resources, we build each other's capacity. The more people are doing this, the easier it gets. When we think about restrictions, particularly around lobbying, this was something I was absolutely terrified of. I did not want to lose my job. However, you can still engage with policy work, with systems-based work without lobbying. And there are resources dedicated to helping people navigate this. I want to highlight Bolster Advocacy, which is one of those resources. They're really wonderful. I would highly recommend checking out their website if this is something that you're concerned about. There's already too many cooks in the kitchen. That's true, but just because a lot of people are doing the work doesn't mean the work is getting done, right? And then finally, no one takes me seriously. I know I say this with a certain amount of privilege, the way that I move through the world, the way that I interact with people. However, I find that when you start showing up, when you start building relationships, when you start building community and you're doing the work, people do take you seriously. There's always gonna be someone who doesn't. That's just, I don't know, that's just life sometimes. But you're going to find allies in this work who are going to uplift you and who are going to support you. So I'm gonna move on to a case study of what we did in Douglas County. I'm gonna cover 5 years, in, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, we'll see how long it takes. For background, my position is funded by RPE grant. My community is a recipient of an RPE grant. So that's the context in which I'm doing this work. In 2008, we received that grant and formed a sexual violence prevention work group in a pre-existing public health coalition. We're kind of like the weird cousins at the family gathering because everyone else is like focused on like tobacco cessation or like walking trails, and we're like working on sexual violence. But the connection is that all public health work groups are ultimately interdisciplinary and have a lot of different stakeholders from a lot of different fields with a lot of different experience, and our work group is no exception to that. We completed a community needs assessment in 2019 where we analyzed pre-existing data regarding risk factors from like census sources, from pre-existing reports, and also hosted a community survey, and we identified kind of what risk factors were the most prevalent in Douglas County. So what we found was that gender pay inequity, alcohol, like a density of alcohol outlets, so where you can purchase and consume alcohol, and a lack of safe and affordable housing were sort of the most potent risk factors in Douglas County. So we decided to focus on those. 2020, we started strategic planning. Also 2020, COVID. And when COVID happened, our strategies no longer were like applicable, right? How do you think about gender pay inequity when people are just losing their jobs in droves? How do you think about alcohol outlet density when establishments and employees at those establishments, again, have no income stream? A lot of our work group members just had no capacity to continue to engage in these strategies because they were so busy trying to survive. However, there was a ton of energy in that moment around housing. COVID really magnified the housing crisis in a lot of communities, and our community was no exception. And so I started, as I mentioned, in October 2020. I came in with sort of a patchwork strategic plan and, a bolo tie and a dream. And I started to do this work. And again, the majority of the energy was around housing, and I just followed that energy. So I'm gonna break sort of our steps down into 4 phases here that I think are going to be applicable no matter what type of systems-based work you're doing. Phase 1 is you get coffee with strangers. For 7 months straight, it's all you do. You pick a coffee spot, you become a regular, and you just meet people. This is a really important part of any type of coalition-based work, right? But particularly when we're entering a field where we don't have expertise or experience, it's really important to listen to the folks that do. So what I found was that a lot of housing advocates, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of folks working in housing were really frustrated because the meetings that they were having were not actionable. Yes, they were distributing, rental assistance, utility assistance, talking about emergency sheltering. However, they didn't feel that that work was actually addressing, again, that root cause of the problem. Because of our limitations, like we could not engage in conversations about emergency shelter, right? As much as I appreciate our funding, I don't think it would be enough to start a community shelter. Likewise, we could not distribute rent and utility assistance. There were already organizations doing that had funding for that. So we really couldn't focus on any of these short-term interventions just out of capacity, which meant that because of our limitations, our conversations were really unique and it kind of gave us an advantage. A lot of folks were coming to these meetings who were really energized by the opportunity to think about, again, like sustainable solutions and not just focusing on emergency interventions. So I spent, like I said, several months meeting folks, talking to them, and essentially conducting one-on-ones. If you've ever done any form of community or grassroots organizing, a one-on-one is essentially a relational conversation. It's really intentional, but it's pretty unstructured in the way that it goes, at least in this instance. And these one-on-ones were essentially like asking people, like, what are you experiencing? What brings you to this work, right? Like, what personal stake do we have in this? How do we build trust with one another? And folks were able in that space to kind of freely share their concerns or freely share what they were seeing, again, outside of the limitations of pre-existing meetings. I left every single one-on-one with like the caffeine shakes and also like a list of terms to research and a list of other people to contact. And from there, I began to build out a network of housing providers. It was really slow work. There's a phrase in community organizing that change happens at the speed of trust, right? So it's frustrating. There's a really urgent need for these types of solutions, but you have to do the work building these relationships because you will fail if you do it alone. So after I met all my new friends, we moved into a really intensive research phase. A lot of folks could speak anecdotally to what they were seeing, what the problems were, but we didn't really have any concrete evidence. And I found that, again, folks who are working in housing, particularly in 2020 and 2021, did not have the capacity to conduct research. At this time, I was, again, within the first year of starting this position, and I was really only doing research. Research about how to best develop curriculum, research about what other communities were doing, research about like what is primary prevention, right? And so I was able to kind of take that capacity that I had and start to build a preliminary bundle of data that sort of helped us identify patterns in a more concrete way. So we started by looking at census data. It's really valuable just for kind of like basic demographics. A lot of communities will have some sort of pre-existing either needs assessment or community strategic planning assessment or community health plan assessment. We looked to those and were able to kind of create a patchwork sort of, again, like rudimentary set of data about what these problems looked like and who was experiencing them. We also compiled an audit of current housing providers, programs, resources, and policies, what already exists in your community. Where are there gaps? Who is doing what? And then lastly, we made a really rough lit review of what other communities have done. So again, coming away from those meetings with all this stuff to look into, sort of following those breadcrumbs and creating like, these are, a dozen housing policies or programs that other communities have successfully implemented. Here's where they've been implemented. Here's how effective they've been, et cetera. So that way we were able to sort of have a big overview of what our possibilities were and use that in tandem with our local data to start narrowing things down. So just to give you an idea of like the shape of what that looked like, Where in Douglas County, Kansas, as I mentioned, Lawrence is the largest city. It's a little over 100,000 folks, but there are several smaller, more rural communities that I've listed here. There's also folks who live in unincorporated county land. Our median income is about $7,000 lower, or $7,000 lower than the state median income. Our minimum wage in Kansas is $7.25. And there's a state law that preempts individual municipalities from raising that on their own terms. We have 3 universities, so we have a pretty large student population. We have a large renter population, about 50% of our homes. Slightly higher in Lawrence are renter occupied. Our median rent from 2000 to 2018 rose about $3,000. However, median renter incomes rose only $8,000 in that same span of time. So when we think about the ratio of income gained versus income expended on housing costs, right? Almost half of that median raise is going towards those median housing cost increases. We also found that 56% of renters are cost burdened, meaning that they pay 1/3 or more of their income towards housing costs. And that number, so half of that half is severely cost burdened, meaning that they spend 1/2 or more of their income on rent, which is a lot of folks, right? That's almost 1/4 of our population. Additionally, our population is mostly white, but when we think about patterns in housing, what we found was that Black and Indigenous people were 3 to 5 times more likely, respectively, than white folks to experience houselessness. Our population of folks experiencing homelessness also had more women than is typical nationally. And additionally, the majority of our housing choice voucher users were either disabled and or elderly. We have about 800 folks using the housing choice vouchers, and there's a wait list of over 400 people. And that wait list is 1.5 to 2 years. And this is really shocking, but really common. The reason that is so stark is because the housing choice voucher program relies on the cooperation of landlords and property managers. We have about 2,000 landlords in Lawrence, and only 200 of them were participating in housing authority programs. What's more troubling is that while some of those property managers may participate in housing authority programs, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're housing voucher users, right? They often have other restrictions like no eviction history, or someone must make 3 times the rent, or they have to have XYZ credit score, which is oftentimes a barrier. So while on paper they're participating in this program, they're not necessarily housing people. We found the same thing with rental assistance. We had a really successful rental assistance program administered through our county. Just in a period of a year and a half, about 1,000 households received rental assistance, and we were seeing the same thing, where landlords were either not taking it up front or taking a month and then refusing to take it, or we kind of had this rash of apartment complexes being purchased by new management, and then new management no longer taking rental assistance or voucher users, and essentially either mass evicting or non-renewing, so when a lease cycle ends, choosing not to renew that tenant. And then we don't really have a lot of emergency shelter options. We have a community shelter that is, like most, very overburdened and very understaffed. Additionally, our other sheltering programs, like our local domestic violence shelter, or we have a program called Family Promise, which is faith-based, have a lot of restrictions as to who and how people can access their services. So this was sort of what we pulled out in that first data dive, where we were looking at census demographic data, really broad strokes. And from here, we were kind of like, okay, there's a lot of problems. This is a mess. But what realistically can we change, right? Where do we actually have capacity, and what's going to have the most impact? So from there, we moved into phase 3, which was action, but that really just means more research. And with that initial sort of rough cut, we began to narrow our scope, again, mostly by identifying what was actually possible given funding, capacity, state or federal preemption, the momentum in the community, et cetera. And so we ended up focusing on increasing legal protections for voucher holders and rent assistant recipients because the burden on these programs was so high and because they are solely dependent in our community on the cooperation of local landlords. This also seemed achievable. Hundreds of other communities do have similar policies that protect housing choice voucher users and rental assistance users, and it was not preempted by state law. So it felt winnable in that way, right? Where these policies, I'll go on to it on the next slide, but a lot of them have been around for like decades. And they have a documented impact on housing choice voucher users. So it felt like something that we could actually move. So we started performing more targeted research on this topic specifically, right? On tenant protections, particularly for those with a non-traditional source of income specifically. And we presented this resource to honestly anyone who would listen, but mostly our city's Affordable Housing Advisory Board, which is what it sounds like. It's an advisory board dedicated to recommending policies, funding decisions, et cetera, to promote affordable housing. Our Human Relations Commission, which is our city commission that oversees our discrimination policies, often called the Human Rights Commission in other cities. Our city commission, which are the decision makers, and then also the community at large. We hosted a couple of different community events where we presented this research to folks, just like free to access. No decision makers, just community members could come in, see what we were researching, give their experiences, their feedback, et cetera. So again, I just want to show you all like what the shape of that research looked like. The term for this type of policy is source of income protections, and it means adding another protected class to a city's pre-existing discrimination code, where source of income, like landlords cannot legally deny someone tenancy based on how they are paying their rent. So this covers not only housing choice vouchers and rent assistance, but other types of subsidies, Social Security or disability payments, mutual aid, support from family, friends, et cetera. Again, this is something that is not groundbreaking. The first instance of this policy was created in 1971. And since then, 20 states and over 100 individual municipalities have passed these types of protections. It's widely recommended as a strategy to increase housing mobility and voucher acceptance by organizations like the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the American Bar Association, dozens of other housing groups, and there's a lot of research from those groups about the efficacy of this type of policy. Something that we heard a lot from decision makers was concerns that this would potentially increase rent, that landlords would increase rent as retaliation against this policy. But that does not bear out in the data. And also they're already increasing rent. So why not try to make a difference? These are effective. In communities without source of income protections, 77% of prospective tenants in a HUD study that was conducted in 2011, I think, were rejected by landlords, which dropped to 33% in communities with these types of protections. These protections also lead to less racial segregation and more housing mobility, particularly for elderly folks and those with large families. So again, this is really easy to talk about, but it was 5 years of work. I'm not gonna read all of this because it's a lot and it's kind of boring, but we started doing housing research in October 2020. We did not make contact with any sort of city board until April 2021, where we presented a 3-minute public comment. I've never talked faster in my life, but, and then, in June 2021, it was formally put on the agenda at the Affordable Housing Advisory Board. We presented more research during that period, and then was deferred to the Human Relations Commission, again, who oversees our discrimination policies and enforcement. We did not connect with them formally until November, and then we presented our research they gave us a liaison, basically, like an individual who's assigned to investigate this. We didn't make contact with that individual until May 2022. Like in between these spans, there was a lot of continuing to strengthen those relationships, particularly with community organizers. And there was a lot of sending emails, which sometimes were responded to. And in 2022, early 2022, with all of the data that we created, we started to just make this super obnoxious 300-page packet of research. Because every time we presented this information, there was like, where's the evidence, right? What's the research? Who else has done this? And so we said, no worries. Here's a big old chunk of paper. And it sounds intimidating, but we made it really easy to navigate, where we created summaries for each piece of research. Everything was linked. We even pulled out key talking points so that even if there was pushback in sense of, we can't read this in 300 pages, like, well, the first 5 pages are dedicated to readability and to navigation. It wasn't until October 2022 that the Human Relations Commission recommended source of income protections to the City Commission. It was not passed until February 2023. It was delayed 2 times because of concerns regarding property managers and landlord feedback. And the result of those delays was all of the enforcement was stripped out of the final ordinance language, in addition to other types of tenant protections that we had put in. So the work is still ongoing. Currently, there is an ongoing lawsuit between roughly organized group of landlords and the City of Lawrence. The ordinance is effective as of June, but again, that lawsuit is ongoing. I honestly don't really expect it to go anywhere, because historically, these types of lawsuits do not rule in landlords' favor when it comes to source of income protections, but who knows? It's Kansas. So it's a lot of work. And like you can see, it took us really like 3 years of active monthly research. And like I said, being kind of obnoxious to even get this policy that has existed in other communities for decades passed. So the work is hard and it's long. And like I said, if you do it alone, you will fail. But we were fortunate in October 2022, a sort of neonatal tenant union formed and started having folks show up to City Commission meetings in droves to make city comment and public comment in support of this ordinance. So what we did following the passage was briefly celebrated and rest. That's us on Valentine's Day 2023. It's myself, Mariel Ferrero, Jazz Bates, who are community organizers, and then Katie Barnett, who's on the Human Relations Commission, cheesing it up and being happy. We started to kind of think about how we could use this niche that we had developed to continue supporting the work, particularly because this ordinance did not pass as we had wanted it to. So like I mentioned, the citywide tenant union formed in October 2022 and turned out like hundreds of community members. I mean, we had folks that would bring food to City Commission meetings because our city is wacky, and our City Commission meetings start at 6 and oftentimes go until past midnight. So folks would bring chili, would bring snacks, baked goods. We had folks driving folks from various like encampments where there were unsheltered people staying to the City Hall so that they could make comment. There was just this huge grassroots efforts that I think really pushed the needle, particularly when you look at that zoomed out timeline. Like we were working for 2 years to connect with these folks, and it wasn't until our community members started coming out in droves that this work actually advanced. So we were able to use a supplemental grant and pay for a week-long community organizing training for Lawrence tenants. Again, that reciprocity. A lot of them were new to organizing. It's a new organization. And through that training, there was like a doubling of member retention in addition to building of their capacity to continue to do future political movements. And this is really important because nonprofits are essentially extensions of the state, right? We're funded by the state. We do the state's work that they should be doing. And we can't carry this torch forever. Like we can't carry the torch of housing justice forever. It has to eventually come from the community. So I was super grateful to be able to, again, have that reciprocal relationship with those organizers. Additionally, we learned as we were doing this research that there was like virtually no data on the experiences of tenants with things like security deposits being withheld, or with screening factors, or with non-renewals, or with feelings of safety in their house, right? So we developed and launched a really comprehensive long survey that kind of focused on gathering the experiences of people living in rental housing as it related to those things. So that again, when we continue to advocate for policy, we could have this resource that we could give to the community of like, this is where the need is. The survey is really exciting, not only because it's the first of its kind, but also because it's really qualitative. So there's a lot of places for people to just share their experiences, and the survey is completely anonymous. When we close the survey period and begin building our reports, we're going to be able to highlight the voices of folks who are actually experiencing discrimination in their housing, or lack of a maintained property, or security deposit withholding, et cetera. We're going to actually be able to share like their words directly. And we're going to run some limited like follow-up interviews with community members who opted in as well. We had a really high in the pie sky goal of having 1,050 responses, so that that's what would be considered with our population a statistically significant or representative sample size. I thought that we were going to get like 40 responses, but we launched this at the beginning of July. It's a long survey. It's 17 pages long. And as of 2 weeks ago, the survey had over 800 responses and is going to close August 31st. So I'm hopeful that we will reach that goal and potentially exceed it. And the only reason we were able to do that was because of those relationships that we built 5 years ago, right? Reaching out to people who weren't necessarily able to attend work group meetings, but having that relationship and asking like, you know, are you able to share this on social media? Are you able to print out paper copies for your clients to use? Are you able to hang up a flyer with pull tabs? And the work group members, like that was not me. That was the work group members kind of making their connections and flexing their relationships to get that distributed. We're hoping to, again, be able to present that to community members and decision makers, to share that freely, to continue to expand this body of research that we started that previously hadn't been collected or centralized at all. So that's us. Oh, also we received a proclamation from the city of Lawrence for promoting fair housing, but I was driving in my car and my car doesn't have air conditioning. And so I had the windows down and the proclamation flew out the window. So you have to take my word for it that it happened. Oh well. So I want to kind of go back to the beginning with those core ideas that we talked about and really ground everything that we did in Douglas County and everything that we learned in a few lessons that relate to those ideas. So the first is that relationships are going to be your foundation. Again, we cannot do it all. We need relationships not only in the nonprofit sector, but also with community members, with community leaders, community organizers. Change is only going to happen in community. I said before, if you do this work alone, you will fail. I know that sounds nihilistic, but it's the truth. Learn from and lift up community organizers. So again, we should not carry the torch of housing justice. It's irresponsible for us working in nonprofit sectors to do so. But we can materially support the efforts of community organizers or of movements that are actually led by those directly impacted, right? Either financially, either even in the sense of like, you know, like, do you want to hold a meeting at our office, right? Or we have a space you can use, or we have technology you can use. If you don't have financial support to throw out community organizers, there are still ways that they can be supported. A really wonderful example of this happening is actually in Kansas City, which is about 45 minutes east of us. They have a just wonderful, robust tenants union called Kansas City Tenants, KC Tenants. And through that organization and a grant they received from People's Action, they were able to not only perform really effective eviction defense at the courthouse in Kansas City during COVID, they also were able to advocate for a tenant's bill of rights suite being passed in Kansas City, in addition to Kansas City creating and funding an Office of the Tenant Advocate to help tenants navigate. So again, that all came from community organizers with material support from a nonprofit. Find your niche. What is needed to move community conversations to community action? Again, just because a lot of people are doing the work does not mean the work is being done. In our case, what was needed was just a bunch of nerds who could do research and who could compile that research and who could present that research. And that kind of persistent, consistent, like this is the evidence, this is the data, this is what other communities have done. That's what really started to move those conversations to action. Impact versus effort is something I always come back to. Again, this is a 1,000-piece puzzle and it's all in the dog's stomach. We can't find all the pieces, so we always have to be measuring potential impacts of a strategy against what we realistically can achieve. It's probably not possible for most folks in this room to leave and start an emergency shelter, right? But it might be possible, again, to connect with an affordable housing advisory board, for instance, or to meet with a community housing provider and hear about what they're doing and go from there. And finally, the end goal of all of these efforts is equity. This is big work. It's really easy to get lost in, but intersectionality and anti-oppression must be your compass. As you develop strategies or explore actions, you have to ask yourself if the work that you're doing is going to materially uplift, empower, or improve the lives of those who are most oppressed. So while we were doing a lot of source of income like advocacy, we heard over and over again this refrain of, why does this have to be policy? Why can't this be incentivization of property managers or landlords to accept source of income or to accept housing choice vouchers or rental assistance? And while I understand the impulse to do that, ultimately that's kind of creating this fallacy that these are individual issues and not systemic issues, right? That these are issues that can be solved by an individual property manager or landlord as opposed to a system that needs to be corrected. Does convincing landlords of disabled people's humanity actually improve, empower, or uplift those who are the most oppressed? Not really. Maybe like a couple of landlords would take housing choice vouchers. But in our community, we actually already had financial incentives for landlords to work with the housing authority. And so while that type of community collaboration is necessary, again, when we think about finding our niche, ultimately our niche is anti-oppression work and is intersectionality and is trying to give directly, again, to those who are most marginalized, most oppressed, most vulnerable. So that's all that I have. I think we have like 15 minutes for Q&A if folks want to do that. I would encourage you all to connect with the people that you spoke with at the beginning of the session as you filter out into lunch and think about like, what is your first step, right? Are you going to return to your home base and hit up a community organizer and learn about what they're doing? Are you going to attend a city commission meeting for 6 hours and hear them talk about development codes? Are you going to start reading housing policy? Like, there are so many first steps that we can take, even though it feels really intimidating. If I can do it, you can too. So